The orphans spent a peaceful 6 weeks at Camp Hurricane. But then came another summons from their old nemesis, Braxton Bragg, and off they went to Tennessee again. They reached the vicinity of Chickamauga Creek in North Georgia just in time for the Battle of Chickamauga, another of the high and low points of their war service. In the fierce fighting on September 20th, 1863, they played a significant role in opening a hole in the enemy line, which led to the most complete defeat ever suffered by a major Union army. But in the same day's fighting, they lost yet another commander when General Helm took a mortal wound. In the aftermath of Chickamauga, as the Confederates besieged the enemy at Chattanooga, Colonel Joseph Lewis of the 6th Kentucky took command of the brigade and held it for the balance of the war. What could not be held, however, was the line of entrenchments Bragg had selected on Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge, facing Chattanooga. On November 23-25, the Federals, now commanded by General Grant, broke out and drove Bragg back in a disgraceful rout. The Confederates had no choice but to retreat to Dalton in North Georgia, where they would winter. If there was good news to be had at all, it was in the joining of the official 5th Kentucky Infantry to the brigade and, for all Kentuckians, in the welcome fact that Bragg was to be replaced as commander of the Army of Tennessee. Now commences another long term of camp life, nothing going on to break the monotony from one week's end to another. Camp Hurricane was situated among hills covered with pine. Our regiment camped on a hill nearly to itself, at the base of which was a large spring of excellent water, which supplied the division. The spring fed a mill pond of considerable size, and under the mill, which was the smallest affair I ever saw, was a very excellent place for bathing. Our camp was on the margin of a small field, in the edge of which stood a small cabin made of pine logs, the only evidence of civilization to be seen. All else around was an interminable forest of pines, the only growth these sterile hills can produce. The boys built arbors of pine boughs, which shielded them from the sun and in a great measure kept off the rain. We pitched the office in a pleasant place, and I was kept pretty busy at times writing. Lieutenant Joseph Benedict left on a leave of absence and willed me his hammock while he remained away. I often tumbled out of it at night while sleeping. There was no field handy in which to drill, and the boys were glad of it. A great deal of rain fell during our stay at Hurricane, which mostly came in the evening. The spring was made a kind of marketplace for the division, where soldiers would speculate in fruit, vegetables, etc. Large watermelons would sell for $40. The neighborhood of the spring was also being made a resort for gambling, when Major Rice E. Graves of Breckinridge's staff made a descent upon the sporting gentlemen and broke up such amusement. This is John Jackman's journal. He was a soldier with the 9th Kentucky Infantry. This chapter is called Breaking Through the Enemy Line. August 7th. Got hold of Great Expectations by Dickens. I partly read this book in Harper's Weekly 2 years ago while at Sister M's. I shall now read it all under quite different circumstances. August 11th. Finished Great Expectations today. Am well pleased with the book. August 21st. Being a day for fasting and prayer, had divine service near camp under a large arbor built for the purpose. August 23rd. Unwell, have been sick for several days. August 24th. Heard from home through a friend. August 26th. At 5 p.m., consigned our arbors to the flames and marched towards Morton. Bivouacked near town for the night. August 27th. All on the train by 10 a.m. and moved off for Meridian, where we arrived. The train ran very slowly. At 8 p.m. Immediately changed cars for Mobile. train running all night. August 28th. Just as the sun was coming up, could look down the long vista of pines and see the tall chimneys of manufactories in the city sending up their inky columns of smoke. Soon we were at the depot and immediately moved to the steamer Natchez. Though we did not stay long in the city, some of the boys had time enough to get on a bender. Mobile looks about the same as it did a year ago when we passed through. The steamer bore us out on the bay and up the Tensaw, where we landed at the terminus of the Montgomery Railroad, disembarked, and bivouacked half a mile from the landings. The day pleasant, and the scenery on the bay beautiful. Right where we are camped, there are no pine trees, which is quite a relief. The land here is a little hilly and looks to be productive. August 29th, took cars for Montgomery at 3 p.m., got to Pollard, touching a corner of Florida at sundown, have been in the pines again for miles. Dark setting on, swung my hammock across the car and went to sleep. August 30th, waked up at daylight and looking out the car, saw that we were still being whirled through pine forests. I judge from this, nothing but pines grow by the road its entire length. At sunrise, got into Montgomery, having been transported 162 miles by rail since leaving Mobile. Immediately got off the cars and moved through the city to the West Point Depot and bivouacked in a pine grove on the common, waiting for transportation. Sunday and the church bells are ringing merrily. Reminds me of peaceful days. In the evening went a muscadine hunting on the banks of the river and got an abundance. Tonight all the boys are in the city having a general spree. Johnny Green and I, all that are left in camp. August 31st. At 8 a.m. moved off on a train for West Point, where we arrived without incident at 4 p.m. At 7, changed cars and arrived at LaGrange, where we had to lay over from 10 until 1 o'clock. The depot at LaGrange was thronged with ladies with nice provisions for us. I was asleep when the train stopped and was waked up by a boy shoving a broiled chicken into my face with other nice things to eat. I looked out at the platform in front of the depot, where there was such a jam of white crinolines and such a chattering of women. I thought at first I was in another world. We had a fine time, as the ladies stayed at the depot until midnight. We found refugees from Kentucky and all parts of the South among them. September 1st. Arrived at Atlanta 9 a.m. and without changing cars, left for Chattanooga at 11 a.m. Got off the train 13 miles from Chattanooga 11 o'clock at night and slept until morning on the side of the rail track. September 2nd. At noon got wagons to haul our baggage, moved 4 miles to Tyner Station and went into camp. Tyner Station is on the Cleveland and Chattanooga Railroad, about 12 miles or less from the latter place. Remained in camp a few days, nothing going on of interest. Had not been in camp but a day or so when I was taken down with intermittent fever, but the doctor took it in time and broke it up. September 6th. The division marched with 2 days' cooked rations. Not having enough transportation to haul our baggage, I am left in camp until tomorrow, when wagons will be sent back for it. I am not well, but feel better. September 7th. At noon today, Colonel Caldwell came back with orders to move the baggage of the division to Chickamauga Station to be shipped to the rear. We had to be in a hurry, too, for our army having left Chattanooga early this morning, there is danger of our being gobbled. We had no wagons to move with and had to press some in the country. Being appointed by the colonel to take charge of affairs, I sent 2 good fellows from our regiment out to press wagons and had the other regiments to do likewise. Soon our boys came back with an old ox wagon, which we kept busy hauling to the station, 2 miles until dark. By that time, all the sick, lame, halt, and blind of the division were at the depot, and mountains of baggage. Had to telegraph for a train of cars to come up for us, which may not come until tomorrow evening or next day. This place is now unarmed, and in all probability will be gobbled yet. When the last load was hauled, we honorably discharged Pompey and his ox team. September 8th, lying about the station all day. In the afternoon, Bushrod Johnson's brigade came to the depot as a guard. We loaded on the cars late in the evening, on the side track all night. September 9th, all the troops gone this morning. At sunrise, our train started down the road, but being so heavy, when we got to Graysville, 8 miles, the cars in which our brigade baggage is loaded left on the switch. Here Colonel Caldwell left me to engineer down the road as best I could. Late in the evening, the last engine was passing, and I got our cars on. We waited at Ringgold for the passenger train to leave, which was crowded with refugees. That night we ran down to Dalton. September 10th, at Dalton, all day, very hot and dusty. Sick, have something like fever. There are so many cars here, no telling when we shall get off. Dullaman got his head shot off in a row during the evening, which was a little variety. Slept on top of a car at night. September 11th, left Dalton at 6 a.m. and arrived at Kingston, 40 miles, at noon. There we found Colonel Caldwell, who had the baggage stored away in tents. Not being well, was left with it, with several others of the regiment. Colonel Caldwell left for the front, going by way of Rome. Kingston is a small, woebegone-looking place, at the junction of the Rome road. September 12th, walked about 2 miles to have my clothes washed, but could not find anyone to undertake the job. Am really sick. Dr. Scott is giving me medicine. September 13th, all quiet today. In the evening, a train passed down with some of the 1st Kentucky Federal Cavalry on board that Forrest had captured at Tunnel Hill. Got tired enough of Kingston. We drew very good rations, and the general of our company would go out bear hunting occasionally, and would also bring in sweet potatoes. I was sick all the while. Longstreet's corps passed up the road during the time. September 17th. To our great joy, Captain Price Newman of our regiment came down for all the officers' baggage and all that were able to go to the regiment. This evening we came up to Resaca on the cars and loaded the baggage on a wagon in waiting and have footed it out 7 miles on the Lafayette Road. We have a walk of 40 miles before us. September 18th. About noon came to the road leading off to where the wagon train is encamped. We left the wagon and started for the regiment. Part of the time our road led over steep hills and had a very tiresome walk. In the evening a party of us left the main road to make a near cut. There were 4 of us, Captain Newman, First Sergeant James Ford of his company, Dr. Scott, our assistant surgeon, and myself. We could hear the cannon booming occasionally. At night, we stopped at a cabin on the roadside and got a good supper, then adjourned to a neighboring pine thicket, where we passed the night nearly freezing, as blankets were scarce. September 19th, on the road early, stopped at a well to wash and breakfast. A lady seeing us sent out some butter and milk. 5 miles brought us to the regiment near Glass's Mills. The brigade had just crossed Chickamauga River at Glass's Ford to support Cobb's and Slocum's batteries, and the wickedest artillery duel ensued I ever saw. Slocum and Cobb had to limber to the rear and move their batteries back across the river. There were several of our regiment wounded. 3 afterward died of their wounds. About the middle of the afternoon, moved a mile or 2 further to the right, and halted in line of battle, sending out a skirmish line, while here we could hear the battle raging further to the right. But before sundown, our division again commenced moving to the right. At sundown, and a little after dark, the musketry rattled incessantly. I don't believe I ever heard heavier volleys of small arms. The word came back that Cleburne was driving the enemy on the right. Having to move 5 or 6 miles, we continued our march until some time after dark, and the night being black, we had a deal of trouble. We at last crossed the Chickamauga at Alexander's Bridge, and not far from the bridge we stopped in an old field for the night. We built a large fire, yet not having any blankets with me, I did not sleep any. The night was very cold, and my large overcoat came in good place. September 20th. Before daylight, the division moved to take position in line of battle. After we had stopped for the night, the field band had been sent to the rear with the horses of the field and staff, and were not back in time, so the colonel, etc., had to foot it. The colonel left me at the fire to tell the musicians where to bring the horses. Daylight came and a heavy frost was on the ground. I waited until long after sunup, yet the drummers did not come. So I shouldered a long bundle of blankets intended to be put on the horses and started for the regiment. I had to pass over the ground where Cleburne had fought the evening before. The dead of both sides were lying thick over the ground. I saw where 6 Federal soldiers had been killed from behind one small tree, and where 8 horses were lying dead, harnessed to a Napoleon gun. Men and horses were lying so thick over the field, one could hardly walk for them. I even saw a large black dog lying mangled by a grape. In the rear of the brigade, I found our ambulance and put the blankets in it, then went on to the regiment. The boys were lying in line of battle and cracking jokes as usual. Many of them I noticed to be in the finest spirits, were in a few minutes afterwards numbered with the slain. All the time, the skirmishers, about 200 yards on advance, were very noisy. About 10 o'clock a.m., Major James Wilson rode up to General Helm, who was sitting against a tree in the rear of our regiment, talking to Colonel Caldwell, and gave him the verbal order from Breckinridge to advance in 15 minutes and adjust his movements to the brigade on the right. The general got up and mounted his horse, laughing and talking as though he was going on parade. I had intended to go along with the infirmary corps, but as the drummers had not come up with the horses, Colonel Caldwell ordered me to go back and see if I could find them. I had not gone far before I came to several of our boys that had been wounded on the skirmish line, and, as the shells were tearing up the ground about them, which makes a helpless man feel very uncomfortable, I helped put them in an ambulance and sent them to a hospital. I went a little farther in hopes of finding the drummers, but they were nowhere to be found. I then started back for the regiment. The rattle of musketry was kept up pretty lively. As I passed along over the field, I could see all the little gullies were packed full of straggling soldiers, but I saw none of our brigade among them avoiding the shells. When I got to the regiment, it was just falling back under a heavy fire, having charged 3 times unsuccessfully. The regiment was greatly reduced by half at least. Colonel Caldwell had been wounded. Out of our company, my old friend James Hunter had fallen with others, and many had been wounded. General Helm had received a mortal wound and had to be borne to the hospital on a litter. Lieutenant Colonel Wycliffe, in command of the regiment, had me to ride the general's horse back to the hospital. Our brigade hospital was more than a mile from the field, across the Chickamauga. The wounded I found scattered over a half-acre of ground, all out of our brigade, too. Here I found one of the refugee drummers on Colonel Helm's horse, which I immediately rode to the regiment, piloting Major Hope and others to the brigade. The sun was then getting low, and Colonel Wycliffe immediately dispatched me on his horse to the wagon train or cook wagons to hurry up the rations, the boys not having had much to eat for 2 or 3 days. I had not been long gone when our troops advanced again on the extreme right, and this time our brigade went over the enemy's works. The loss, though, was nothing compared to that of the morning fighting. When I got to the cook train, our wagon had gone to the regiment with rations, which I had accidentally passed in the darkness. I then rode back to the hospital and stayed until morning. This concludes the 8th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more stories and leave a comment.